Ah, here I am, listening to Kansas. Wishing Clay was here to present his thesis work on spatial and temporal changes in aeolian redistribution of sediments and nutrients following fire. Oh wait, Clay's here. Hi Clay, I'm going to stop listening to Kansas and maybe you can tell us about your thesis work.
All right. Hi, Jen. Sure, I can do that for you. Like you said, talking about aeolian redistribution following fire, and I got a quick teaser. Semi-arid landscapes produce more dust following fire. So, what we were hoping to figure out is what does that dust look like and where does it go on a landscape when you add topography. So as you can see here, we've got our dust trap in a burned landscape, and that's kind of what we wanted to take a look at with this study. So here is a typical boring undisturbed site. We've got sagebrush and grasses that are buffering the soil surface and keeping everything pretty well locked down. This is one of our sites out in Reynolds Creek Experimental Watershed. They're all paired with hydro and climatic data loggers out in the experimental watershed. In these boring undisturbed sites, collected boring undisturbed dust. So we had small rates of deposition, silt and clay size material, and generally a regional geochemistry track in our background dust samples. Then in August of 2015, there was a fire out there that produced this haboob, and this is exciting post-fire wind erosion. And this looks a little bit different. We have increased rates of deposition, clay up to fine sand-sized, grain size distributions, and a local geochemistry. And that's kind of what we're expecting to find, but we'll dive into this all a little bit deeper as we go. So the questions we wanted to answer were physical and geochemical characteristics of our post-fire dust deposits, as well as the differences in the fluxes from our background rates to immediately post-fire, and kind of how long that signature lasts on the landscape. Try to get at the influence of topography on that dust flux. Where do we see more dust being deposited immediately following the fire, and what influence that might have on landscape development? You know, if we're preferentially depositing dust in certain areas, what's that doing for landscape development? So we did it all at Reynolds Creek Experimental Watershed with 14 dust traps, as you saw there on those 2-meter poles. And so we're looking at vertical deposition of dust, not horizontal flux, which is key. But because of small sample sizes, we grouped them into 6 subsets. And that was based on the kind of geophysical landscape as well as proximity to the fire. So our soda fire occurred in August of 2015. Jen and colleagues got out there rapidly to deploy 14 of our dust traps at a bunch of climate stations across the experimental watershed in different ecotones and at different distances from the fire, as well as different topographic positions. So within the burned area, we had some sites at high exposed ridge lines and other sites down in topographic lows in sheltered locations. Field methods, very complicated dust traps, pretty standard dust trap design with just some marbles on top of a cake pan for collecting dust. And we had sampling intervals in the fall, winter, and summer. So our fall sampling interval was the smallest. The summer stretched, you know, through summer months, and winter obviously was winter. So 3 times a year we would collect these things. Once we brought them back to the lab, we did loss on ignition to look at carbon versus mineral mass. We used a master sizer for analyzing grain size distributions of very fine materials, and ICP-MS for the geochemical trace of our samples. Looking at our background undisturbed dust rates, they were comparable to previous work in the region. We were checked in just a little bit below the Mojave Desert as far as our annual dust flux goes, and kind of tracked right in the middle of that regional dust source deposition rates. Grain size distributions were just what we'd expect in the silt size for our background rates, and our trace element geochemistry had a pretty strong relationship with the upper continental crust, with some notable increases in soluble salts with barium and strontium and uranium because of our regional dust sources being playa and alluvial fan complexes in Nevada and California. So that was expected as well. One thing that we saw that our study kind of was able to get at a little better than a lot of other annual studies was the seasonal variability in dust flux. So the fall season tended to have the highest flux rates. And that's largely because of climatic variables. Summer, you might be blowing around of dust, but the main mechanism to pull that dust out of the atmosphere onto the surface is rain. And in the semi-arid West, rain is hard to come by in the summer. So that largely explains our increases in deposition in the fall. However, looking at our post-fire versus our sage and conifer sites, post-fire had in certain sites up to an order of magnitude more deposition immediately following the fire compared to our sagebrush or conifer sites in an undisturbed setting, and dive into that a little bit more. We also saw increases in coarse burnt organic material deposition immediately following the fire, which then fell off as soon as the first growing season hit. So that first photo on the top left shows a burnt landscape. Soil burn severities were only low to moderate, but we had complete vegetation incineration, so no more surface roughness, and those low density bits of organic material were able to be picked up in saltation and short-term suspension and deposited in our dust traps. That trace falls off immediately as native forbs and grasses recolonized, March, April in the area. And so we lose that trace of burnt organic material at the first growing season. So you'll be hearing me talk about disturbed versus undisturbed, and that's what that's referring to. Our disturbed sites are going to be the sites that were in the burned area or proximal to the burned area before the first growing season, and we lose that trace pretty much after the first growing season, and at that point all sites become undisturbed technically. So as far as our grain size distributions go, we had increase in D90 within the burned area, so we were able to mobilize larger grains without that surface roughness, and we see larger spatial variance, which is just showing, this is watershed wide. Our grain size distributions in the fall of 2015 had a large standard deviation as sites within the burned area were collecting, larger grain sizes, whereas the following year, watershed wide, we see a much more homogeneous grain size distribution across all sites within the watershed, indicating we're back to our background vertical deposition. Kind of the last smoking gun for our localized mobility of sediment and carbon following the fire is the geochemical trace. If we consider soils in the area to be some combination of bedrock and aeolian material, as they are, then we would expect our local soils to look like that. So our hill slope soils track pretty closely to bedrock in our uplands, where we had our burned area traps, and the valley soils, the lust derived soils, track a lot more similar to our unburned traps. So that's just showing the different sources of our soils. Immediately following the fire, our fall of 2015 burned area tracks pretty close to our hill slope soils, just showing again that we are moving local material, and not only are we moving the local material, but we're moving it preferentially to sheltered positions over the landscape. So increased post-fire mass flux, bigger grain sizes, more carbon, and a local geochemical signature is what we found within our burned area and sites proximal to the burned area. So based on our results, we see a spatially homogeneous deposition of aeolian material during undisturbed times where we don't have saltation or meter to kilometer scale suspension moving local material around. We have a generally stable site. However, following disturbance, we are clearly moving more material with a different geochemical trace and larger grain sizes to these preferential areas on the landscape. So if we're thinking about what's controlling that, it's topography and wind direction. Immediately following the fire, Jen and her colleagues went out there and found these wind drifts on northeast facing slopes for the most part, which tracks and correlates pretty well with where snow drifts on the landscape as well. And that is what we saw running around out there in the winter, digging pits in these snow pits. The winter following the fire, you could see layers of burnt organic material that was being mobilized and drifted. And while this was a much smaller amount than what happened after the fire, it was just validating that that is where things are moving. And so these episodic pulses of increased mass flux to spatially controlled locations driven by decreases in friction velocity, where we have no more surface roughness. We've got increased shear stress in specific areas where prevailing wind direction and topography intersect. And that's leading to these episodic pulses of material onto these topographically controlled locations. And that has impacts. In the Dry Creek experimental watershed to the north, we see higher volumetric moisture content, deeper soils, and steeper slopes on north-facing aspects. And we also see higher loess fractions on those north-facing hill slopes. So, there's whole biogeochemical feedback loops that lead to those things. But we are arguing that, in these semi-arid regions, after fire, these large pulses of sediment are contributing to that. In the Reynolds Creek experimental watershed, Nick patented work looking at total mobile regolith based on hill slope curvature and found similar results where our northeast facing slopes and our ridge lines had soil thicknesses in the centimeter scale, where just a few meters to the northeast in swales and leeward slopes, we were finding, meter plus thick soils. So we argue that these episodic pulses of increased mass flux are driving some of these biogeochemical feedback loops and contributing organic material and sand-sized grains that can, and clay-sized grains that can lead to all of the different geophysical features that we see across the landscape. And thanks to everybody who helped out. Any questions?
Yay! Wow, Clay, I'm really glad you happened to be here to present your thesis work for this AGU session. Before, I want to make sure now, is there any place people can go to look for more information about this work? Has this been published anywhere?
Earth surface processes. When would that, was that volume 45 or 46?
I believe it was published on the 26th of May, 2020. And the title there is Spatial and Temporal Changes in Aeolian Redistribution of Sediments and Nutrients Following Fire, with Clayton Roehner as the first author. And I'll make sure we list that associated with this. Let's open it up to questions from the audience in just a second. I guess I really wanted to bring home for this session, many folks have looked at the effects of post-fire water erosion. Where, what geographic areas do you think that the impact of post-fire wind erosion will be most important?
Oh, it's definitely in the semi-arid landscapes across the world where we see this. And that's a pretty large chunk, 30% of the continental surface around the world globally. So semi-arid regions are where this really, obviously water erosion plays a key role as well, but the interplay between the two is more potent in semi-arid regions where, there's no, after a fire, there's no trees to offer surface roughness. Once the sagebrush burns or the grasses burn, it's a barren landscape and very easily erodible by aeolian processes.